Carl Jung explained why smart people feel everything too deeply. Have you ever felt like your intelligence is actually a curse? Like the more you see, the harder it becomes to live. Maybe you sense the pain behind people's smiles. Maybe you feel overwhelmed by your own mind. You're not crazy. You're not broken. Carl Jung had a name for this kind of suffering. He called it the burden of consciousness. In this video, we'll dive into the hidden cost of seeing too much, knowing too much, and feeling too deeply, and why this very pain may be your greatest spiritual calling. Part 1, the curse of awareness, when seeing becomes suffering. Carl Jung understood something most people never dare to confront: that awareness. True. Raw, unfiltered awareness is a double-edged sword. It can illuminate, but it can also burn. It can liberate, but it can also isolate. And for the deeply intelligent or hyper-aware individual, life becomes less about living in the conventional sense and more about surviving the weight of all that is seen. To be intelligent in the Jungian sense is not merely to be logical, or well-read, or capable of abstract thinking. Jung's definition of intelligence encompassed psychic depth, emotional resonance, symbolic interpretation, and an acute sensitivity to the unconscious forces shaping human behavior. And when these faculties are heightened, they become painful. They act like lenses that see too deeply into a world that others skim across. In modern society, intelligence is often portrayed as an advantage, a tool for success, innovation, and power. But Jung knew its darker side. With intelligence comes vision, and with vision comes burden. The more one sees, the less one can pretend. The illusions others comfortably inhabit, the myth of permanence, the safety of norms, the righteousness of institutions begin to collapse under the scrutiny of a mind that questions instead of conforms. The psychological weight of perception. The first layer of suffering for the intelligent comes from what Jung called the inflation of consciousness. When consciousness expands, when a person begins to think symbolically, to interpret human behavior archetypically, to analyze deeply, it becomes increasingly difficult to function within systems that reward simplicity and obedience. Highly intelligent individuals may struggle to engage in small talk, feel disillusioned by political or religious institutions, or even experience existential dread triggered by everyday life. This kind of perceptual overload is not just intellectual, it's somatic and emotional. The body stores tension from unresolved paradoxes. The heart aches from understanding too deeply the pain others ignore. Jung noted that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. For many highly intelligent people, the neurosis lies in trying to repress the unbearable truth they cannot unsee. These truths might be that people often live inauthentically, wearing personas to survive, and that systems meant to protect the vulnerable often exploit them, that cultural values are arbitrary, and morality is rarely absolute, that human nature is, at its core, conflicted, capable of both unspeakable cruelty and divine compassion. To carry these truths without a container for processing them, without ritual, community, or myth, is to suffer the lonely road of the perceptive. Jung emphasized the role of individuation, the psychological process through which a person becomes who they truly are, differentiated from collective norms. But individuation is often triggered by suffering, especially the kind born from insight. The intelligent suffer because they cannot unsee. They notice subtle shifts in tone, hidden motives, body language cues. They recognize manipulation and authority, but also in themselves, which they sense emotional currents others are blind to. And they intuit unspoken truths, even when it would be easier to live in denial. This depth isolates them. Even as children, many intelligent people report feeling like outsiders. They don't enjoy what other children enjoy. They ask philosophical questions too early. They may be bullied or silenced for being too intense, too serious, or too sensitive. Over time, this leads to the construction of what Jung called the persona, a mask that allows one to survive the social world by hiding the truth of one's inner depths. But the persona, no matter how well constructed, becomes a prison. The longer the intelligent individual must perform normalcy, the further they drift from their authentic self, and this fragmentation creates profound internal tension, the spiritual despair of clarity. For Jung, the human psyche is not built for constant exposure to the raw truths of life, without myth or symbolic meaning to frame them. Modern intelligence often strips life of its symbolic layers in favor of cold rationality. The result is spiritual despair. Imagine seeing through every system you once trusted and realizing that politics is theater. Because religion often functions more as control than liberation. By education rewards conformity, not critical thinking. And even love can be transactional and self-serving. These realizations are not paranoia. They're patterns that emerge when one examines life with a Jungian lens. The tragedy is not in discovering these truths, but in realizing there is nowhere to go after discovering them. How does one live in a world that has been demystified? Jung believed that without reconnection to the symbolic life, the burden of intelligence leads to nihilism. People who see too much lose their grounding. They cannot return to innocence, yet have not found a replacement mythology strong enough to give life meaning. This is the liminal space, a psychic no man's land between ignorance and transcendence. Many intelligent individuals linger here for years, battling depression, anxiety, or a deep existential exhaustion that even therapy cannot fully address. They crave not answers, but depth, not positivity, but meaning, overthinking versus overfeeling the dual pain. The common stereotype is that highly intelligent people think too much, but Jung would argue that they also feel too much. The intellectual is not detached from emotion. They often feel so deeply that the only way to cope is to intellectualize their pain. They bury emotion under analysis. They dissect instead of grieve. They explain instead of feel. This coping mechanism creates an imbalance. The head dominates the heart. The ego takes refuge in understanding, while the unconscious quietly screams for integration. Over time, this suppression results in emotional burnout, cynicism, difficulty forming deep relationships, numbness masked as maturity. Jung warned that what we repress does not disappear. It becomes shadow. And for the intelligent, the shadow is often emotion, grief, vulnerability, joy, and all the things the mind cannot control. The more a person relies on intelligence as armor, the more disconnected they become from their soul. To heal, the intelligent must descend not further into analysis, but into embodiment, into myth, into mystery, into the irrational, the emotional, the archetypal. This descent is terrifying for a mind that has built its identity on certainty, but it is also the only path forward. The burden of being awake. Perhaps the heaviest burden for the intelligent is this, the awareness that most people are asleep and prefer it that way. Jung wrote extensively about the collective unconscious, the reservoir of shared human instincts, fears, and patterns. When one begins to individuate, they rise above the collective. But in doing so, they lose their connection to it. This is why the intelligent often feel like ghosts. They walk among others, but are not with them. Conversations feel hollow. Routines feel absurd. Even celebrations feel tinged with falseness. The world becomes a theater where the intelligent can no longer suspend disbelief. And yet, they still long for connection. They still need love, community, and laughter. But they must find it in new ways through depth, not through conformity. Jung believed that the only way to carry the burden of awareness was to create, to turn perception into art, thought into philosophy, pain into myth. The intelligent must become midwives of the unconscious, birthing new visions for a world that doesn't yet understand them. That is the sacred task. Part 2. Intelligence as isolation. Why the smart feel so alone. Carl Jung believed that the journey of the intelligent, self-aware person is almost inevitably a lonely one. Not because they are antisocial, not because they are arrogant, but because there are simply fewer people who can meet them where they are. Isolation is not a choice for the intelligent. It is a side effect of perception. To understand why intelligence and isolation often go hand in hand, we must revisit one of Jung's foundational concepts, the process of individuation. In Jung's psychology, individuation is the journey of becoming one's true self, of differentiating from the collective norms, expectations, and social scripts that most people unconsciously follow. And individuation, Jung warned, separates you. It isolates you from the group mind. It strips away the comforting illusion of belonging to a collective. The deeper your consciousness grows, the more you realize how much of life is performative. And once you see the performance, it's hard to keep playing your part. The solitude of the perceptive. For the intelligent person, even ordinary social interactions can become unbearable. Why? Because they can see through them. They recognize the subtext behind words. They pick up on the emotional dissonance others ignore. They feel the pressure to conform, to entertain, to pretend, and it exhausts them. Many report, feeling alienated at family gatherings where conversations remain surface level, withdrawing from friendships that revolve around gossip or shared distractions, avoiding group settings where authenticity is not welcome. It's not that they want to be alone. It's that they can't find many places where their real self fits. This solitude is different from loneliness. It's not simply the absence of people, it's the absence of resonance. The intelligent person may be surrounded by others but still feel fundamentally alone. Because what they seek is not company, it's connection. Jung once said, loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. This kind of existential loneliness is agonizing. It is not soothed by social media, by busyness, or even by casual friendships. It demands something deeper. What Jung called the self, a unifying center of meaning that can withstand solitude without collapsing into despair. The misunderstood mind. Another cause of isolation for the intelligent is the persistent experience of being misunderstood. Throughout life, they are often labeled too deep, too intense, and too sensitive, just too philosophical, not too serious. As children, they may have been praised for being smart, but not truly seen. Their questions may have been dismissed, their emotional sensitivity punished, their need for depth ignored. This early experience creates a psychic wound. The intelligent learn to either hide their depth or overexpress it in search of validation. Neither strategy brings peace. Later in life, this leads to relationships where they either shrink themselves to avoid overwhelming others, or they remain single because they cannot find someone who matches their wavelength. For Jung, this is part of the journey toward wholeness. The road to individuation is strewn with the pain of disconnection, but he also believed that those who stay true to themselves, who refuse to numb or dilute their consciousness, eventually discover a different kind of connection. One not based on similarity, but on authenticity. The paradox of the outsider. The intelligent often find themselves caught in a paradox. They long to connect, but they see too clearly to connect easily. They want to be part of the world, but the world often feels false or shallow to them. Jung explored this through the archetype of the outsider, the one who walks the edges of society, observing, questioning, seeing but rarely fitting in. This outsider is not just socially excluded, they are psychologically exiled. They carry truths the world does not want to hear. They embody contradictions the culture wants to avoid. They walk between worlds, the world of the conscious and the unconscious, of spirit and matter, of light and shadow. This psychological exile is the cost of consciousness. And yet, Jung did not see this exile as failure. He saw it as preparation. The outsider, the loner, the misunderstood, these are the ones who hold the potential to become healers. Artists, mystics, and visionaries, but only if they do not let bitterness or despair consume them. The individual who goes his own way will inevitably bring something new into the world. Jung said, but that path is not easy. It requires walking alone, often without confirmation, often with doubt. The reward is not comfort, it is transformation. The hunger for depth. One of the most painful aspects of being deeply intelligent is the hunger for depth in a world that worships speed and simplicity. The intelligent person doesn't want more facts. They want meaning. They don't want more noise. They want truth. They don't want to be entertained. They want to be moved. This hunger is rarely satisfied in day-to-day life. Most social interactions skim the surface. Most media is designed for mass appeal. Most institutions value obedience over insight. And so the intelligent person retreats. They find solace in books, in philosophy, in art, in solitude. But even these can become isolating if not shared. Jung believed that the modern world was spiritually starved, and that the most intelligent among us suffer the most, not because they are broken, but because they feel the starvation more acutely. They crave what Jung called the symbolic life, a life where inner depth is honored, where myth and mystery are alive, where the soul has a place to speak. Without this, they drift, they numb, they question their sanity. The dangers of disconnection. Jung warned that isolation, if not consciously integrated, can lead to dangerous psychological consequences. A person who is too isolated may begin to feel superior to others, inflation of the ego, fall into despair or nihilism, collapse of meaning, become addicted to abstraction, detachment from the body, project their unmet needs onto others, shadow displacement. The line between healthy solitude and toxic alienation is thin, and many intelligent people, without guidance, fall on the wrong side of it. This is why Jung insisted on the importance of relationship, not shallow social interaction, but deep, meaningful connection with others, with the unconscious, and with the self. Even the most awakened mind needs mirrors. We need others not to validate our ego, but to challenge it, to humanize it, to ground it. He often prescribed active imagination, journaling, dream analysis, and symbolic art not as hobbies, but as lifelines for the intelligent mind, adrift in a sea of meaningless noise. The goal was never to become less intelligent. It was to become more integrated, to allow the mind, heart, body, and soul to speak to each other, to weave the intellect into the fabric of the human experience, rather than letting it dominate or detach. Part 3, the shadow of the gifted, when intelligence meets darkness. Carl Jung's theory of the shadow is one of the most crucial keys to understanding why many highly intelligent people suffer internally, often more than anyone around them realizes. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, represents the parts of ourselves we repress, deny, or disown traits we don't want to see, feel ashamed of, or are unconscious of entirely. And here lies the paradox: the more intelligent a person is, the more likely they are to develop a powerful, sophisticated shadow. Why? Because intelligence, when not balanced by emotional maturity and self-awareness, can become a tool of repression rather than reflection. The mind becomes so skilled at rationalizing, analyzing, pushing, and explaining away discomfort that it can bury vast portions of the self without even realizing it. Jung often warned the brighter the light of consciousness, the darker the shadow it casts, the intellectual's blind spot. One of the traps for highly intelligent individuals is that they are very good at thinking about their emotions, rather than actually feeling them. They develop elaborate theories about their behaviors, other people's actions, and life in general, but they often bypass the raw, vulnerable truths buried in their emotional body. For example, instead of feeling sadness, they might analyze why sadness is occurring biologically. Instead of acknowledging jealousy, they might moralize that it's beneath them. Instead of owning their fear, they might intellectualize it as a philosophical dilemma. This creates a form of emotional dissociation, where intelligence becomes a mask for vulnerability. Jung would call this a misalignment of the ego and the unconscious. When the ego refuses to confront the shadow grows more powerful in silence. Over time, this shows up as a deep loneliness masked as independence, an emotional repression disguised as stoicism, arrogance born from insecurity, hyper-rationality used to avoid intimacy. The truly intelligent may become imprisoned in their own minds, always analyzing, never surrendering, always in control, never letting go. The archetype of the wounded intellectual. Jung understood archetypes not as fixed identities, but as living forces within the collective unconscious. The wounded intellectual is one such archetype, brilliant, observant, articulate, but secretly burdened with inner conflict and emotional wounds that logic cannot heal. This archetype often presents itself as the gifted child who grows up emotionally neglected, the philosopher who understands humanity but cannot trust people, i.e. the therapist who can help others but avoids their own healing, the academic who knows everything but feels nothing. They become experts at disconnection from their body, their emotions, and the felt sense of life. And often, this disconnection isn't conscious. It masquerades as enlightenment. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." For the intelligent, this avoidance takes the form of thought. They retreat to the intellect because it's safer than the heart. But no matter how brilliant the mind, the soul will not be ignored forever. The shadow demands to be seen. The dangers of shadow suppression. When the intelligent suppress their shadow, it doesn't disappear, it leaks. It leaks into sarcasm, into cynicism, into passive aggressiveness. It shows up in moments of rage that seem out of character, in anxiety that can't be reasoned with, in relationships that mysteriously collapse without understanding why. It also shows up in projection. Jung emphasized that whatever is rejected in the self will be projected onto others. Intelligent individuals, in particular, may unconsciously project their denied shadow onto less intelligent people. They may judge them harshly, dismiss them as shallow, or look down on them as inferior, not realizing that they are projecting their own disowned simplicity, vulnerability, and desire to just be without analysis. In this sense, the shadow becomes not just a personal issue, but an interpersonal one. It affects relationships, careers, and one's ability to experience intimacy, humility, and compassion. Intelligence as a defense mechanism. Jung observed that for many people, intelligence itself becomes a defense mechanism. It is used to avoid discomfort, to gain approval, to control uncertainty. But this defense, while powerful, is limited. It cannot protect against the forces of the unconscious. Consider the person who uses their intellect to control every part of their life, who micromanages their schedule, analyzes every decision, avoids spontaneity, and suppresses emotion. On the surface, they seem composed. Underneath, they're often riddled with anxiety and burnout. Why? Because the unconscious is not rational. It doesn't obey logic. It is emotional, primal, mythic. It communicates in dreams, in symbols, in synchronicities, and it will not stay silent. Jung believed that the more we suppress the unconscious, the more it returns with force through depression, obsession, addiction, or even psychosomatic illness. The mind alone cannot carry the soul. The shadow is a source of power. Here is where Jung's genius emerges. He did not believe the shadow was evil. He believed it was repressed potential. Inside the shadow of the intelligent person lies, or rejected creativity, suppressed playfulness, disowned sensuality, hidden vulnerability, long forgotten joy. The very things that could make them whole are the things they have exiled in their pursuit of control and superiority. Jung encouraged not the destruction of the shadow, but its integration. To become whole, we must turn toward what we've rejected, not to indulge it, but to understand it, to make peace with the parts of ourselves we've labeled as bad, irrational, or unworthy. For the intelligent person, this means allowing imperfection. It means stepping out of the head and into the heart. It means risking emotional honesty, surrendering the need to be right, and cultivating relationships that reflect not just their mind, but their humanity. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. The journey of integrating the shadow is not a detour from intelligence. It is what transforms intelligence into wisdom. Part 4, hyper-awareness and existential pain. One of the most devastating effects of heightened intelligence, from a Jungian perspective, is hyper-awareness, a relentless mental clarity that goes far beyond mere knowledge. It's a condition of consciousness where one sees not just the surface of things, but the mechanisms, contradictions, and futility underneath. And with this clarity often comes a deep, inescapable pain. Jung saw this kind of awareness not as a flaw, but as a stage of consciousness that few reach and even fewer survive without existential crisis. For the hyper-aware individual, life is never simple. Every conversation contains subtext. Every action holds multiple meanings. Every silence is loaded. Nothing is just what it is. Everything is a symbol, a signal, a system. And this level of perception, while rare and profound, is psychologically taxing. Seeing the matrix. Carl Jung believed that individuals who are more conscious are often the first to recognize the deep fragmentation of the modern world. They perceive the illusion of choice in society. They see the emptiness in cultural rituals. They recognize how advertising manipulates desire, how media shapes narratives, how institutions prioritize power over truth. They watch others live comfortably within systems they know are broken and that knowledge isolates them. They question, and why do we chase goals that bring no fulfillment? Why do people obsess over appearances while their souls wither? Why does love feel transactional? Why do we fear death when we barely live? These aren't theoretical questions. They are lived experiences for the hyper-aware. This leads to what Jung called existential confrontation, a direct face-off with the absurdity, impermanence, and chaos of life. And there are no easy answers. Jung once wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." In the case of the hyper-aware, their neurosis may be a kind of inner torment born not from trauma, but from truth. They suffer not because they are delusional, but because they see too clearly. And clarity, without meaning, becomes agony, the loss of innocence. Most people rely on some version of innocence to function, whether it's faith in fairness, belief in progress, or trust in authority. These psychological comforts act as a buffer between the self and the chaos of the universe. The hyper-aware, however, often lose this innocence early through grief, betrayal, or just the natural unfolding of their own mind. Once lost, it's nearly impossible to regain. They cannot return to the comforts of convention. They cannot pretend the world makes sense. They live with what existentialists call radical freedom, the terrifying awareness that life has no inherent meaning, and that any meaning must be created through conscious effort. This kind of freedom is overwhelming. It creates a vacuum that many fill with distractions, addictions, or ideologies. But the hyper-aware often reject these substitutes because they see their artificiality. So what are they left with? Silence, solitude, emptiness. And from that space, either despair or transformation. The emotional toll of perceiving too much. Hyper-awareness is not just cognitive, it's emotional. It's not only seeing too much, but feeling too much. Jung believed that the unconscious speaks not in words, but in images, emotions, and symbols. The more awake the conscious mind becomes, the more exposed it is to the turbulence of the unconscious. The hyper-aware person often experiences mood swings tied to no clear cause, empathic overload from sensing others' unspoken emotions, anxiety rooted in overthinking outcomes, consequences, and possibilities. a guilt over their own privilege, pain, or perceived failure to act. They feel both their own suffering and the suffering of the world. They feel the weight of collective trauma, even if it's not theirs. They are often overwhelmed by news, injustice, or the suffering of strangers. This is not being dramatic. It's a form of psychic sensitivity Jung would recognize as the gift and curse of an expanded consciousness. The problem is that society has no structure for holding this kind of pain. It is pathologized, medicated, or dismissed. But Jung believed this kind of pain, existential pain, was meaningful. It was the birthplace of individuation. Meaninglessness is crisis. The most terrifying moment for the hyper-aware person is when they realize nothing inherently matters. This is the shadow of awareness, the nihilistic void that opens up when every comforting belief is questioned, and every institution is stripped of its idealism. It is not the depression of loss, it is the collapse of worldview. It is the realization that everything is constructed, temporary, and fragile. Jung warned against both sides of this dilemma: the inflated ego, which believes it can make meaning through willpower alone; the collapsed ego, which surrenders to despair. He believed the only true answer was the symbolic life, the ability to connect to archetypes, dreams, myths, and inner truths that transcend rational understanding. This is why many hyper-aware individuals turn to art, spirituality, depth psychology, or mysticism, not as an escape, but as a way to rebuild meaning on their own terms. Your vision will become clear. Jung said, only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside? Dreams. Who looks inside? Awakes. But awakening is painful. It means seeing the world as it is, not as you wish it to be, and carrying that vision without losing your soul. The risk of intellectual despair. Many highly intelligent fall into what Jung might call intellectual despair, a condition where the mind, having stripped life of illusion, becomes unable to see anything but contradiction, suffering, and absurdity. They become over-identified with the rational mind. They dismiss emotions, myth, and intuition as weak or irrational. They crave certainty but live in ambiguity. They want answers, but reality only gives them symbols. This is a dangerous position, because the human psyche cannot survive on intellect alone. It needs meaning, ritual, creativity, love, and spiritual nourishment. The soul starves in a world of endless analysis. Jung saw this clearly in the patients he treated. Many were not suffering from mental illness in the medical sense, but from meaninglessness, a loss of inner connection. He encouraged these individuals not to become less intelligent, but to descend into the unconscious, into dream, into the forgotten parts of themselves, to balance their mind with soul. He often guided them to ask different questions. Not what is true, but what is true for me. Not what should I do, but what is trying to emerge from within me. Not what do others expect, but what does my inner self require? These are symbolic questions. They cannot be answered logically, but they are the only ones that bring healing. Part 5, Childhood of the Gifted. When the world misunderstands you early. Carl Jung placed an enormous importance on the formative impact of childhood, especially in shaping the unconscious structures of the psyche. For individuals with high intelligence or heightened perceptive awareness, childhood is often not a place of innocence. It is a place of misunderstanding, loneliness, and premature emotional responsibility. The pain doesn't always come from overt abuse or trauma. It often stems from subtle neglect, emotional invalidation, and the failure of adults to recognize the depth of the child's inner world. Jung understood that those who are gifted early in life, whether intellectually, emotionally, or spiritually, often carry a burden that is invisible to those around them. That burden is the early awakening of consciousness in a world that is not ready to meet it. The inner world of this gifted child. Highly intelligent or perceptive children do not experience the world like their peers. From an early age, they Notice contradictions in adult behavior. Sense the emotional states of others, even when unspoken. Ask existential questions. Why do people die? Why do people lie? React strongly to injustice. Cruelty, or falsehood, and feel overwhelmed by environments others consider normal. These are not children simply seeking attention. These are children who feel the heaviness of life long before they have the tools to process it. Their minds are advanced, but their nervous systems are still fragile. They are souls out of sync with their developmental stage. Jung wrote, "The child is exposed to the same collective unconscious as the adult, but has no language to mediate it." In other words, these children carry deep impressions, archetypal images, collective emotions, ancestral wounds, but no way to explain or communicate what they feel. This leads to internalized confusion. They begin to believe, something must be wrong with me. Why doesn't anyone else feel what I feel? Maybe I'm too much. Misattunement and the wound of being unseen. Jung emphasized the significance of the early mother complex, which is not just about the literal mother, but about the child's initial experience of containment, emotional safety, and mirroring. For the gifted child, this mirroring often fails not because their caregivers are malicious, but because they are simply unprepared to handle the child's depth. The child may receive praise for being smart, quiet, or mature, but their deeper needs go unmet. And their questions are ignored because they're too adult. And their sensitivity is labeled as weakness. And their need for solitude is pathologized. And their complexity is simplified into stereotypes. This creates a split in the psyche, what Jung would later describe as the construction of a false self or persona. The child learns to present only the parts of themselves that are rewarded their intelligence, politeness, or compliance. Meanwhile, their true emotional world goes underground. This is not just a psychological inconvenience. It becomes the foundation of neurosis in adulthood. Parentification and early emotional labor. Another common pattern among gifted children is parentification. When the child takes on the emotional responsibilities of the adult, they become the mediator in conflicts, the therapist to a wounded parent, the good one who keeps the peace. Jung saw this as a form of psychic inversion. The child, instead of being allowed to develop freely, becomes fused with the emotional needs of the parent or family system. Their own development is interrupted by the need to cope. This often manifests in adulthood as chronic over-responsibility, anxiety in relationships, fear of expressing needs, difficulty setting boundaries. The irony is that the child who was so mature for their age often grows into an adult who struggles with basic emotional regulation, not because they lack intelligence, but because they skipped vital stages of emotional development. The archetype of the exiled child. Jung's work with archetypes helps us frame the experience of the misunderstood gifted child through the lens of the exiled child, the one who is different, who sees too much, and who must journey alone. This archetype appears in myths and fairy tales. The orphaned hero and the misunderstood prophet, the child sent away to the forest, the gifted one cast out by the village. These stories are not just metaphors, they are psychic templates encoded in the collective unconscious. Many highly intelligent adults carry this archetype within them, still unconsciously living it out the wound of exile. They move through life with a low-grade sense of being other, alien, or unwelcome. But Jung believed that the archetype of the exile contains the seed of transformation. The very experience of being cast out prepares the individual for the hero's journey, a descent into the unconscious, and a return with new vision. The pain of early misunderstanding becomes the raw material for later individuation, if the person is willing to face it. The longing for home. One of the most painful legacies of a gifted, misunderstood childhood is the lifelong search for home, not a physical place, but an emotional and spiritual container where the self can be fully known and accepted. This search often shows up in adulthood as intense longing for soul-deep friendships or partnerships, repeated attempts to fix dysfunctional relationships, hoping they will finally feel safe, idealizing mentors, therapists, or spiritual communities, owned a tendency to romanticize childhood in hindsight. Even if it was painful, the gifted individual may not realize that what they are really seeking is not a person or a place, it is the mirror they never received. They are trying to complete the original emotional circuit that was interrupted. Jung's prescription was not to find that home in the external world, but to create it internally through the development of the self, the inner center that contains all parts of the psyche. This involves confronting the shadow, grieving the lost childhood, and integrating the archetype of the child not as a wound, but as a source of renewal. In every adult, Jung wrote, there lurks a child, an eternal child, something that is always becoming, is never completed, and calls for unceasing care, attention, and education. This inner child is not weak. It is the key to creativity, spontaneity, and the sense of wonder that hyper-awareness often eclipses. To reclaim it is to begin healing. Part 6, the pain of integration, when death becomes a cross to carry. Carl Jung warned that the journey towards psychological wholeness, what he called individuation, was not a peaceful path. It is not about becoming balanced or well-adjusted in the conventional sense. It is about integrating every part of the self, especially the ones we were taught to reject: the shadow, the irrational, the wounded inner child, the primitive impulses, the divine impulses, and everything in between. For those who are deeply intelligent or hyper-aware, this process is especially grueling. Why? Because intelligence often gives the illusion that understanding is the same as transformation. But Jung was adamant knowing your wounds is not the same as healing them. In fact, the more complex the mind, the more elaborate the defenses, the more gifted the intellect, the more painful the descent. Integration is a descent, not an ascent. Jung's model of transformation is rooted in alchemical imagery. Just as base metals must be subjected to intense fire and dissolution before they can become gold, so too must the psyche undergo breakdown, fragmentation, and suffering before it can achieve wholeness. This means that the intelligent person, who has spent their life building a fortress of rational understanding, must now let it burn. Integration requires descent into what Jung called the inferior function, the least developed, most uncomfortable part of the psyche. For intellectuals, this is often the realm of emotion, instinct, and vulnerability. It means, 1. Sitting with grief instead of explaining it away, feeling shame without trying to solve it, owning anger without moralizing it, accepting confusion without rushing for clarity. This descent feels like death because, in many ways, it is. The ego must die to be reborn. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. For the intelligent, who are often used to control, competence, and achievement, the rawness of integration is profoundly humbling. The ego's resistance to wholeness. The ego prefers what is familiar, predictable, and socially rewarded. It clings to identity. I am the smart one. I am the one who has it figured out. I don't need anyone. But individuation requires surrendering identity not to become nothing, but to become everything you are. Jung believed that the ego often resists integration through 3 major strategies. 1. Spiritual bypassing, escaping into philosophy, religion, or abstract truth as a way to avoid psychological pain. 2. Shadow projection, externalizing repressed traits onto others, especially those who appear weak, emotional, or irrational. 3. Perfectionism, attempting to earn love or worth through flawless performance rather than self-acceptance. The intelligent are especially susceptible to all 3. They can rationalize any avoidance. They can speak fluently about trauma without touching their own. They can mask deep shame behind productivity. But the unconscious cannot be tricked. It waits. It dreams. It erupts. It sabotages. Eventually, the pain becomes too loud to ignore. And this is where the true work of integration begins. The loneliness of inner work. Another painful reality Jung identified is that integration is a solitary process. No one can do it for you. Others can walk beside you, but the journey inward must be traveled alone. This isolation is amplified for the intelligent, who are already outsiders by nature. As they begin to strip away the protective layers of intellect, they often realize that many of their relationships were built on performance, not presence. They may experience loss of friendships that were based on mutual distraction, a disillusionment with mentors or systems they once revered, emotional distance from family members who don't understand their depth, alienation from communities that avoid the unconscious. This pruning is necessary, but painful. It leaves the person raw, vulnerable, and unsure of who they are without their old masks. Jung compared this process to a psychic death, which precedes rebirth. The intelligent, who once found strength in knowing, must now learn to find strength in not knowing and surrender. In silence, in shadow. The shadow's gift. As integration continues, the person begins to reclaim parts of themselves they once disowned. This includes not only pain, but power. The shadow, Jung taught, is not just darkness. It holds creativity, instinct, intuition, sensuality, joy, rage, and life force. The intelligent person, often conditioned to suppress these things in favor of reason, begins to feel them stir again. They may rediscover artistic passions, want to connect more deeply with their body, cry for the first time in years, may fall in love, not with an idea, but with a person, and experience awe, wonder, or spirituality in ways that defy logic. These are not regressions. They are integrations. The intellect is not discarded. It is placed in proper relationship with the rest of the psyche. This balance is what Jung called wholeness. Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being. He wrote, but by integration of the contraries. True intelligence, then, is not measured by IQ, degrees, or analysis. It is measured by a person's capacity to hold paradox, to feel fully, and to become inwardly united. The cross of consciousness. Jung often spoke of the suffering that comes from being more conscious than the world around you. He likened it to a kind of crucifixion where the sensitive, intelligent, or spiritually attuned individual carries a burden that others don't see. This cross is not punishment. It is initiation. It strips away the false self, tests the soul, and refines the psyche. But it is heavy. It includes grieving the illusions that once comforted you, or holding tension between opposites without collapsing into certainty. I'm living without external validations. I'm accepting that healing is nonlinear, messy, and often invisible. Many give up. They return to the comfort of intellect alone. But those who continue find something far more valuable than certainty. They find authenticity. They become whole, not perfect, not enlightened, but grounded, complex, real. And in doing so, they become what Jung hoped all of us could be, not just thinkers, but wounded healers, people who carry their scars with wisdom, who speak not from ego but from experience, and who shine light not to escape darkness, but to walk others through it. Part 7. Wisdom versus intelligence, what Jung knew that others missed. Carl Jung never idolized intelligence. In fact, he often treated pure intellectual ability with suspicion, not because he distrusted the mind, but because he believed intelligence without wisdom could be dangerous. In Jungian psychology, intelligence is not synonymous with consciousness, nor is it equivalent to wholeness. In today's world, we often worship intelligence. We admire cleverness, academic achievements, sharp reasoning, and mental speed. But Jung understood something much deeper. Intelligence is what helps you survive. Wisdom is what helps you live. The truly intelligent person is not necessarily wise. And the wise person is not always conventionally intelligent. Wisdom, in Jung's system, arises not from intellect alone, but from the painful process of integration, a confrontation with the unconscious, the shadow, the irrational, and the archetypal layers of the self, the limits of raw intelligence. Jung recognized that intelligence has limits. It is limited to what can be known, measured, articulated, or observed. It tends to work linearly, using cause and effect, logic, analysis, and language. But the psyche, according to Jung, is not linear. It is symbolic. It is mythic. It communicates through paradox, metaphor, dreams, images, and emotion. The problem arises when intelligence tries to dominate the psyche, when it believes that what cannot be explained does not exist. This arrogance leads to a spiritual emptiness, detachment from the body, emotional repression, a reductionist worldview that strips life of mystery. Jung called this intellectual inflation, when a person becomes identified with their thinking function to the exclusion of everything else. Inflated intelligence is clever, but it cannot love. It can analyze, but it cannot grieve. It can predict outcomes, but it cannot surrender to mystery. Knowledge rests not upon truth alone, but upon error also. Carl Jung. To Jung, wisdom begins where intelligence ends, where the mind reaches its limits, and the soul begins to speak. Wisdom is rooted in the unconscious. In Jungian thought, wisdom emerges not from mastery of external facts, but from a relationship with the unconscious. The unconscious is the totality of all that is not yet conscious, our dreams, instincts, repressed emotions, ancestral patterns, symbols, and archetypes. The intelligent person wants to dissect the unconscious, but the wise person dialogues with it. They learn to interpret dreams not literally, but symbolically, and recognize projection and withdraw it. Respect synchronicity without needing to prove it. Accept suffering as meaningful, not merely to be avoided. This is a key distinction. Intelligence seeks control. Wisdom seeks relationship. Jung would say that wisdom is born when we surrender the ego's desire for certainty and allow the deeper self to guide us. The self, in Jungian psychology, is the center of the total psyche, the unification of conscious and unconscious, light and shadow. It speaks not in reason, but in images and inner knowing. The path to wisdom is the path toward this self. The role of suffering in wisdom. Intelligence often protects itself from suffering through analysis. It keeps things at a distance. It labels, categorizes, or intellectualizes pain. But Jung taught that true transformation only occurs through suffering, not suffering for its own sake, but suffering that is fully felt, explored, and integrated. Wisdom requires descent into the very places the intelligent mind tries to avoid, onto the chaos of heartbreak, and the terror of not knowing, and the shame of failure, the fear of death. In these moments, the mind has no answers, and that is where wisdom is born. Jung compared this process to alchemical transmutation, the transformation of lead into gold. The lead is your shadow, your wounds, your unconscious complexes. The gold is wisdom, but you cannot skip the fire. You cannot bypass the grief. You cannot outthink your own soul. Many intelligent people resist this process. They think their minds can solve pain, but pain is not a problem, it is a portal. Wisdom walks through it. Humility is a marker of wisdom. Another distinction Jung made between intelligence and wisdom is that wisdom is always humble. The intelligent may feel superior. They may correct others, dominate conversations, or pride themselves on being the smartest in the room. But the wise person knows that the psyche is too vast, too mysterious, and too contradictory to ever fully comprehend. Wisdom is not the accumulation of knowledge. It is the awareness of how much we do not know. It is the ability to say, I don't know. Maybe both things are true. This doesn't make sense. But I trust it. My truth is evolving. This humility opens the door to dialogue not just with others, but with the unconscious itself. The wise person does not demand clarity from life. They learn to hold the tension of opposites without collapsing into dogma. This is what Jung called holding the opposites, the capacity to tolerate paradox without needing resolution. It is the foundation of inner maturity, the wise use of intelligence. Jung did not dismiss intelligence. He simply believed it must be placed in service to something greater than itself. When intelligence is married to wisdom, it becomes discernment instead of judgment, an empathy instead of superiority, creativity instead of control, an insight instead of analysis. The intelligent mind can navigate complexity, but only the wise soul can navigate contradiction. In Jung's model, the ideal is not to destroy the intellect, but to integrate it into the larger psyche. The intellect becomes the servant of the self, not its ruler. It becomes a translator of dream, a container for feeling, a bridge between conscious life and unconscious reality. In this integration, the individual becomes whole, not just smart, but wise, from knowledge to meaning. Perhaps the most important distinction Jung makes is that intelligence pursues knowledge, while wisdom seeks meaning. Knowledge asks, how does this work? Wisdom asks, why does this matter? Knowledge solves problems. Wisdom transforms people. Jung believed that our era suffers not from a lack of knowledge, but from a lack of meaning. And it is the intelligent who feel this most acutely. They can achieve, succeed, produce, and still feel empty, because the soul is not nourished by facts. The soul craves ritual, beauty, myth, depth, and presence, and only wisdom can feed it. This is why so many intelligent people eventually turn to depth psychology, spirituality, or the arts not to escape reason, but to complete it. They realize that the mind, as powerful as it is, cannot hold the fullness of human experience. Only the soul can do that. Part 8, the gift behind the burden, a new vision of intelligence. Carl Jung's psychological framework offers something rare in the modern world, not a condemnation of suffering, but a transmutation of it. For the deeply intelligent, the spiritually sensitive, or the hyper-aware, life often feels like a burden, like carrying a weight few others understand. But Jung's legacy reminds us that within that burden lies the seed of something sacred. What begins as pain can evolve into purpose. What starts as alienation can mature into insight. And what feels like a curse in early life may ultimately reveal itself as a profound calling. The hidden purpose of suffering. Jung viewed suffering not as a punishment, but as a pathway. Every symptom, every neurosis, every breakdown was, in his view, a message from the unconscious, a symbolic cry for integration. He believed that our deepest wounds were invitations from the self to become more whole. For the intelligent, who suffer from over-awareness, existential loneliness, or psychic disconnection, this pain is not meaningless. It is the beginning of the individuation journey. Jung would say, if you feel too much, it's because you are meant to feel deeply. If you see too much, it's because you were born to illuminate what others avoid. But to activate this gift, the burden must first be accepted, not rejected, not bypassed, but embraced as sacred. The privilege of a lifetime. Jung wrote, is to become who you truly are. This becoming is not easy. It requires descending into the shadow, confronting the unconscious, integrating opposites, and surrendering the ego's desire for control. It means sacrificing comfort for authenticity, but the outcome is a person who is no longer fragmented, someone whose intelligence has become wisdom, whose suffering has become depth. The birth of the inner guide. In Jungian psychology, the process of individuation leads to the emergence of the inner guide, an archetypal figure that appears in dreams, myths, and inner experiences. This guide may take the form of a wise elder, a mystical teacher, a divine presence, or simply an inner voice. What matters is that this guide represents the psyche's capacity for self-healing and self-direction. It is the part of us that knows what the conscious ego cannot yet understand. For the intelligent person, who has relied on logic and reason to navigate life, the discovery of this inner guide marks a turning point. It signals a shift from outer authority to inner authority. This is not the abandonment of intellect, it is its evolution. The mind no longer dominates, but listens. It becomes a servant of the self. From here, life becomes less about control and more about dialogue with the unconscious.